Grady and Niald, unsweating in their night-black coats, did not cheer. Standing beside the cook fire they had built a little away from everyone else, they merely looked at him. Expectant looks, he thought. Expecting what? That was the question he always asked himself about them. The Ashaman made him uneasy, more than Aes Sedai or wise ones. Women channeling the power was natural, and not exactly anything a man could be comfortable around. Plain-faced Grady appeared a farmer despite his coat and sword, and Niald a popinjay with curled mustaches. Yet Perrin could not forget what they were, what they had done at Demise Wells. But then he had been there too. Light help him he had. Pulling his hand from the axe at his belt, he dismounted. Servants, men and women from Lord Dobrin's estates in Carrion, came running from the lines where the horses were picketed to take their mounts. None stood taller than Perrin's shoulder. Country-clad folk, forever bowing and curtsying obsequiously. Fail said he just upset them when he tried to make them stop, or at least not bob around him so often. In truth, that was how they smelled when he did, and they always went back to bobbing in an hour or two. Others, nearly as many as the Two Rivers men, were working with the horses or around the long rows of high-wheeled carts that hauled all their supplies. A few were darting in and out of a large red and white tent. As usual, that tent made Perrin grunt gloomily. Berylane had a larger one back in the Mayenner part of the camp, plus one for her 2 maids and another for the pair of thief-catchers she had insisted on bringing. Anura had a tent of her own, and Galien as well, but only he and Fail possessed one here. For himself, he would have slept under the sky like the other men from home. They had nothing over them at night but a blanket. There was certainly no fear of rain. The Carrienan servants bedded down beneath the carts. He could not ask Fail to do that, though, not when Berylane had a tent. If only he could have left Berylane in Carrion. But then he would have had to send Fail into Bethal. A pair of banners on tall, fresh-cut poles in the middle of a clear space near the tent soured his mood further. The breeze had picked up a trifle, though it was still too warm. He thought he heard that thunder again, faint in the west. The flags unfolded in slow waves, collapsed to their own weight, rippled open again. His crimson-bordered red wolf head and the red eagle of long-dead Menetherin, out in the open again, despite his orders. Perhaps he had stopped trying to hide after a fashion, but what was now Ghealdan had been part of Menetherin. Alejandro would not be soothed by hearing of that banner. He managed a pleasant face and a smile for the stocky little woman who curtsied deeply and took Stepper away, but it was a near thing. Lords were supposed to be obeyed, and if he was supposed to be a lord, well, he seemed to be making a poor job of it. Fists on her hips, Megden stood studying those rippling flags as her horse was taken off with the rest. Surprisingly, Brianna had both their bundles held awkwardly. She wore a petulant scowl directed at the other woman. "I have heard about banners like those," Megden said suddenly, and angrily. There was no anger in her voice, and her face was smooth as ice, but her fury filled Perrin's nose. "They were raised by men in Andor, in the Two Rivers, who rebelled against their lawful ruler. Ibarra is a Two Rivers name, I think." "We don't know much about lawful rulers in the Two Rivers, Mistress Megden," he growled. He was going to skin whoever had put them up this time. If stories about rebellion had spread this far, he faced too many complications already without adding more. "I suppose Morghese was a good queen, but we had to fend for ourselves, and we did." Abruptly, he knew who she minded him of. Elaine. Not that it meant anything. He had seen men 1,000 miles from the Two Rivers who could have belonged to families he knew back home. Still, she had to have some reason for anger. Her accent could be Andoran. "Things aren't as bad in Andor as you might have heard," he told her. "Caemlyn was quiet last I was there, and Rand, the Dragon Reborn, means to put Morghese's daughter Elaine on the Lion Throne." Far from being mollified, Megden rounded on him, blue eyes blazing. He intends to put her on the throne? No man puts a queen on the lion throne. Elaine will claim the throne of Andor by her right. Scratching his head, Perrin wished Fail would stop watching the woman so calmly and say something. But all she did was tuck her riding gloves behind her belt. Before he could think of what to say, Linny darted in, seizing Megden's arm and giving her a shake fit to rattle her teeth. You apologize, the old woman barked. This man saved your life, Megden, and you forget yourself. A simple country woman speaking so to a lord? Remember who you are, and don't let your tongue land you in hotter water. If this young lord was at odds with Morghese, well, everyone knows she's dead, and it's none of your affair in any event. Now apologize before he grows angry. Megden stared at Linny, her mouth working, even more startled than Perrin. Again, she surprised him, though. Instead of erupting at the white-haired woman, she slowly drew herself up, shoulders squared, and looked him in the eye. Linny is entirely right. I have no right to speak to you so, Lord Ebara. I apologize. Humbly. And I ask your pardon. Humble? Her jaw was stubborn, her tone proud enough for an Aes Sedai, and her sense said she was ready to chew a hole in something. You have it, Perrin said hastily, which did not seem to placate her one bit. She smiled, and maybe she intended gratitude, but he could hear her teeth grinding. Were women all crazy? They are hot and dirty, husband, Fail said, putting a hand in at last. And the last few hours have been trying for them, I know. Aram can show the men where to clean themselves. I will take the women with me. I'll have damp cloths brought to wash your hands and faces, she told Megden and Linny. Gathering up Brianna with a gesture, she began herding them toward the tent. At a nod from Perrin, Aram motioned the men to follow him. As soon as you finish your wash, Master Gil, I'd like to talk with you, Perrin said. He might as well have made that spinning wheel of fire. Megden whipped around to gape at him, and the other two women froze in their tracks. Talonvor was suddenly gripping his sword hilt again, and Balwar rose on his toes, peering over his bundle, head tilting this way, then that. Not a wolf, perhaps. Some sort of bird, watching for cats. The stout man, Basil Gill, dropped his belongings and leaped a foot in the air. Why, Perrin, he stammered, snatching off the straw hat. Sweat made tracks in the dust on his cheeks. He bent to pick up his bundle, changed his mind, and straightened again hastily. I mean, Lord Perrin, I thought it was you, but with them calling you Lord, I wasn't sure you'd want to know an old innkeeper. Scrubbing a handkerchief across his nearly bald head, he laughed nervously. Of course, I'll talk to you. Washing can wait a little longer. Hello, Perrin, the hulking man said. With his heavy-lidded eyes, Lamgwyn Dorn appeared lazy despite his muscles and the scars on his face and hands. We heard about young Rand being the Dragon Reborn, Master Gil and me. Should have figured you'd have come up in the world, too. Perrin Ebara's a good man, Mistress Megden. I think you could trust him with anything you've a mind to. He was not lazy, and he was not stupid either. Aram jerked his head impatiently, and Lamgwyn and the other two followed, but Talonvor and Balwar dragged their feet, casting wondering glances back at Perrin and Master Gil. Concerned glances. And at the women. Fail had them moving again as well, though with plenty of darted looks at Perrin and Master Gil, at the men trailing Aram. Suddenly, they were not so pleased at being separated. Master Gil mopped his forehead and smiled uneasily. Light, why did he smell afraid, Perrin wondered. Of him? Of a man tied to the Dragon Reborn, calling himself Lord and leading an army, however small, threatening the Prophet? Might as well throw gagging Aes Sedai into it, too. He would take the blame for that one way or another. No, Perrin thought wryly. Nothing in that to frighten anybody. The whole lot of them were probably afraid he might murder them all. Trying to put Master Gil at ease, he led the man to a large oak 100 paces from the red and white tent. Most of the great tree's leaves were gone, and half those left were brown, but massive limbs spreading low provided a little shade, and some of the gnarled roots stood high enough to serve as benches. Perrin had used one for just that, twiddling his thumbs while camp was being set. Whenever he tried to do anything useful, there were always 10 hands snatching it away from him. Basil Gill was not eased, however much Perrin asked after the Queen's blessing, his inn in Camelin, or recalled his own visit there. But then perhaps Gill was remembering that visit was not the thing to calm a man, with Aes Sedai and talk of the Dark One and a flight in the night. He paced anxiously and hugged his bundle to his chest, shifted it from one arm to the other, and answered in a bare handful of words, licking his lips between. Master Gill, Perrin told him finally, stop calling me Lord Perrin. I'm not. It's complicated, but I'm not a lord. You know that. Of course, the round man replied, at last seating himself on one of the oak roots. He appeared reluctant to set his bundled things down, drawing his hands from them slowly. As you say, Lord Perrin. Rand, the Lord Dragon, he really means the Lady Elaine to have the throne? Not that I doubt your word, of course, he added hurriedly. Pulling off his hat, he began mopping his forehead again. Even for such a round man, he seemed to be sweating twice as much as the heat called for. I'm sure the Lord Dragon will do just as you say. His laugh was shaky. You wanted to talk to me, and not about my old inn, I'm sure. Perrin exhaled wearily. He had thought nothing could be worse than old friends and neighbors bowing and scraping, but at least they forgot sometimes and spoke their minds, and none of them was afraid of him. You're a long way from home, he said in a gentle voice. No need to go too fast, not with a man ready to jump out of his skin. I wondered what brought you here. Not troubles of any kind, I hope. You tell him right, Basil Gill, then he said sharply, marching up to the oak. No embroidery, mind. She had not been gone very long, yet somehow she found time to wash her face and hands and work her hair into a neat white bun on the back of her head, and to beat most of the dust from her plain woolen dress. Bobbing a perfunctory curtsy in Perrin's direction, she turned to shake a gnarled finger at Gill. 3 things annoy to distraction. A tooth that aches, a shoe that pinches, and a man that chatters. So you hold to the point and don't go telling the young lord more than he wants to hear. For a moment she held the gaping innkeeper with an admonitory stare, then abruptly gave Perrin another quick curtsy. He does love the sound of his own voice. Most men do. But he'll tell it to you properly now, my lord. Master Gill glowered at her and muttered under his breath when she waved sharply for him to speak. Bony old, was what Perrin heard. What happened, the simple and straight of it, the round man glared at Lenny again, but she did not appear to notice, was that I had some business down in Lucard, a chance to import wine, but you're not interested in that. I took Lamgwyn along, of course, and Brianna, because she won't let him out of her sight an hour she doesn't have to. Along the way, we met Mistress Dorlane, Mistress Magdin, as we call her, and Linny and Tallenvor, and Bulwer, of course, on the road, near to Lugard. Magdin and I were in service in Murandy, Linny put in impatiently, until the Troubles. Tallenvor was an armsman to the house, and Bulwer the secretary. Bandits burned the manor, and Our Lady couldn't afford to keep us, so we decided to travel together for protection. I was telling it to Linny, Master Gill grumbled, scratching behind his ear. The wine merchant had left Lugard for the country for some reason, and he shook his head. It's all too much to go into, Perrin. Lord Perrin, I mean. Forgive me. You know there's trouble everywhere nowadays, one kind or another. Seems like every time we ran from one kind, we found another, and always getting further from Camelin. Till here we are, tired and grateful for a rest. And that's the short of it. Perrin nodded slowly. That could be simple truth, though he had learned that people had 100 reasons for lying, or just shading the truth. Grimacing, he raked fingers through his hair. Right. He was becoming suspicious as a Kyrianan, and the deeper Rand tangled him, the worse it got. Why on earth would Basil Gill, of all people, lie to him? A lady's maid, accustomed to privilege and fallen on hard times? That explained Magden. Some things were simple. Lenny's hands were folded at her waist, but she watched with a keen eye, no little like a falcon herself, and Master Gill began fidgeting as soon as he stopped talking. He seemed to take Perrin's grimace as a demand for more. He laughed, more on edge than amused. I haven't seen so much of the world since the Aiel War, and I was considerably skinnier then. Why, we've been as far as Amador. Of course, we left after those Shonchan took the city, but truth, they aren't any worse than the White Cloaks that I could... He cut off as Perrin leaned forward abruptly and seized his lapel. Shonchan, Master Gill. Are you sure of that? Or is it one of those rumors like the Aiel or Aes Sedai? I saw them, Gill replied, exchanging uncertain looks with Lenny. And that's what they call themselves. I'm surprised you don't know. Word's been running ahead of us all the way from Amador. We Shonchan want people to know what they're about. Strange people with strange creatures. His voice picked up intensity. Like shadow spawn. Big leathery things that fly and carry men. And these things like lizards. Only they're big as horses, and they have 3 eyes. I saw them. I did. I believe you, Perrin said, releasing the man's coat. I've seen them too. At Falma, where 1,000 White Cloaks died in minutes, and it had taken dead heroes of legend, called by the Horn of Valir, to throw the Shonchan back. Rand had said they would return, but how could they have so soon? Light. If they held Amador, they had to have Tarabon as well, or most of it. Only a fool killed a deer when he knew there was a wounded bear behind his back. How much had they taken? I can't send you to Caemlyn right away, Master Gill, but if you stay with me a while longer, I'll see you there safely. If staying with him any length of time was safe. The Prophet, White Cloaks, and now maybe Shonchan added in. I think you're a good man, Lenny said suddenly. I'm afraid we didn't tell you the whole truth, and maybe we should. Lenny, what are you saying? Master Gill exclaimed, bounding to his feet. I think the heat's getting to her, he told Perrin. And all the travel. She has strange fancies sometimes. You know how old folks can get. Hush now, Lenny. Lenny slapped away the hand he was trying to put over her mouth. You mind yourself, Basil Gill. I'll old you. Magden was running from Talonvor, in a manner of speaking, and he was chasing her. We all were. 4 days now. And near killing us and the horses both. Well, it's no wonder she doesn't know her own mind half the time. You men snarl up a woman's wits so she can hardly think, then you pretend you've done nothing at all. A lot of you ought to have your ears boxed on general principle. The girl's afraid of her own heart. Those two should be married, and the quicker the better. Master Gill gaped at her, and Perrin was not sure his own mouth might not be hanging open. I'm not certain I understand what it is you want of me, he said slowly, and the white-haired woman leaped in before he was well finished. Don't pretend to be dense. I won't believe it in you for a moment. I can see you have more wits than most men. That's the worst habit you men have, making believe you don't see what's plain under your noses. What had happened to all those curtsies? Folding thin arms across her chest, she eyed him sternly. Well, if you must pretend, I'll set it out for you. This Lord Dragon of yours does whatever he wants, the way I hear. Your prophet picks out people and marries them on the spot. Very well. You snatch up Magden and Talonvor and marry them. He'll thank you, and so will she, when her mind settles. Stunned, Perrin glanced at Master Gill, who shrugged and made a sickly grin. If you will forgive me, Perrin told the frowning woman, I have some matters I must see to. He hurried away, only looking back once, Lenny shaking a finger at Master Gill, berating him despite his protests. The breeze was wrong for Perrin to hear what they were saying. In truth, he did not want to. They were all crazy. Berlane might have her 2 maids and her thief-catchers, but Fail had her own attendants of a sort. Close on 20 young Tyrans in Carienen were sitting cross-legged near the tent, the women in coats and breeches with swords belted on, just like the men. None wore their hair longer than the shoulder, and men and women both had it tied back with a ribbon, imitating the Aiel tail. Perrin wondered where the rest were. They seldom strayed far from the sound of Fail's voice. Not causing trouble, he hoped. She had taken them under her wing to keep them out of trouble, she said, and the Light knew they would have gotten into it, left back in Carien with a great lot of young fools just like them. In Perrin's opinion, the whole lashing of them needed a swift kick in the bottom to knock some sense into them. Dueling, playing at Giotto, pretending to be some sort of Aiel. Idiocy. Lucille rose to her feet as Perrin came closer. A pale little woman with red ribbons pinned to her lapels, small gold hoops in her ears, and a challenging stare that sometimes made the 2 Rivers men think she might like a kiss, despite her sword. Right then, the challenge was stony hard. A moment behind her, Arla stood too, tall and dark, with her hair cut short as a maiden's, and her clothes plainer than most of the men's. Unlike Lucille, Arla made it clear she would as soon kiss a dog as any man. The pair made as if to move in front of the tent to block Perrin's way, but a square-chinned fellow in a puffy-sleeved coat barked an order and they sat again. Reluctantly. For that matter, Perlin thumbed that block of a chin as though he might be reconsidering. He'd worn a beard the first time Perrin saw him. Several of the Tyrant men had them, but Aiel did not wear beards. Perrin muttered about foolishness under his breath. They were Fail's to the bone, and the fact that he was her husband meant little. Aram might be jealous of his attentions, yet Aram at least shared his affections with Fail. He could feel the young idiot's eyes on him as he strode inside. Fail would skin him if she ever learned that he hoped they would keep her from trouble. The tent was tall and spacious, with a flowered carpet for a floor and sparse furnishings that folded for storage on a cart. Most of them. The heavy stand mirror certainly could not. Except for brass-bound chests draped with embroidered cloths and doubling as extra tables, straight lines of bright gilt decorated everything down to the washstand and its mirror. A dozen mirrored lamps made the interior nearly as bright as outside, if considerably cooler. And there were even a pair of silk hangings dangling from the roof poles, too ornate for Perrin's taste. Too rigid, with the birds and flowers marching in lines and angles. Dobrain had set them up to travel like Carrion and nobles, though Perrin had managed to lose the worst of it. The huge bed, for one, a ridiculous thing to travel with. It had taken up almost a whole cart to itself. Fail and Megden were sitting alone together, worked silver cups in hand. They had the air of women feeling one another out, all smiles on the outside, yet with a hint of sharpness to the eyes, a hint of listening for something behind the words, and not a clue as to whether they would hug in the next instant or draw knives. Well, he thought most women would not actually go so far as knives, but Fail could. Megden appeared much less travel-worn than she had, washed and clean, dust brushed from her dress. A small mosaic top between them held more cups, and a tall, sweating silver pitcher that gave off the minty scent of herb tea. Both men looked around at his entrance, and for an instant they had almost exactly the same expression, coolly wondering who was barging in, and not at all pleased with the interruption. At least Fail softened hers immediately with a smile. Master Gill told me your story, Mistress Dorlane, he said. You've faced hard days, but you can be sure you're safe here till you decide to leave. The woman murmured thanks over the rim of her cup, but she smelled wary, and her eyes tried to read him like a book. Megden also told me their story, Perrin, Fail said, and I have an offer to make her. Megden, you and your friends have had trying months behind, and you tell me of no prospects ahead. Enter my service, all of you. You will still have to journey, but the circumstances will be much better. I pay well, And I am not a harsh mistress. Perrin voiced his approval immediately. If Fail wanted to indulge her fancy for taking in strays, at least he wanted to help this lot too. Maybe they would be safer with him than wandering around alone at that. Choking on her tea, Magden nearly dropped her cup. She blinked at Fail, dabbing at the damp on her chin with a lace-edged linen handkerchief, and her chair creaked faintly as she turned, strangely, to study Perrin. I thank you, she said at last, slowly. I think. Another moment's perusal of Perrin, and her voice picked up. Yes, I thank you, and I accept your kind offer gratefully. I must tell my companions. Rising, she hesitated in setting her cup on the tray, then straightened only to spread her skirts in a curtsy suitable for any palace. I will try to give good service, my lady, she said levelly. May I withdraw? At Fail's assent, she curtsied again and backed away 2 steps before turning to go. Perrin scratched his beard. Somebody else who would be bobbing at him every time she turned around. No sooner had the tent flap dropped behind Magden than Fail put her own cup down and laughed, drumming her heels in the carpet. Oh, I like her, Perrin. She has spirit. I'll wager she would have singed your beard over those banners if I hadn't saved you. Oh, yes, spirit. Perrin grunted. Just what he needed, another woman to singe his beard. I promised Master Gil to look after them, Fail, but can you guess what that Linny asked? She wanted me to marry Magden to that fellow Tallenvor. Just stand them up and marry them, whatever they said. She claimed they wanted. He filled a silver cup with tea and dropped into the chair Magden had vacated, ignoring its alarming groans under his sudden weight. In any case, that nonsense is the least of my worries. Master Gil says it was the Shonchan took Armador, and I believe him. Light, the Shonchan. Fail tapped her fingertips together, staring across them at nothing. That might be just the thing, she mused. Most servants do better married than not. Perhaps I should arrange it. And for Brianna, too. The way she went running out of here to check on that big fellow as soon as her face was clean, I suspect they should be all ready. There was a gleam in her eye. I won't have that kind of behavior in my servants, Perrin. It just leads to tears and recriminations and sulking. And Brianna will be worse than he is. Perrin stared at her. Did you hear me? He said slowly. The Shonchan have captured Amador. The Shonchan, Fail. She gave a start. She really had been thinking about marrying off those women. Then smiled at him, amused. Amador is a long way yet. And if we do meet with these Shonchan, I'm sure you will deal with them. After all, you taught me to perch on your wrist, didn't you? That was what she claimed, though he had never seen any sign of it. They might be a touch more difficult than you were, he said dryly, and she smiled again. She smelled extremely pleased for some reason. I'm thinking about sending Grady or Neil to warn Rand no matter what he said. She shook her head fiercely, smiles evaporating, but he pushed on. If I knew how to find him, I would. There has to be some way to get word to him without anyone learning of it. Rand had insisted on that, more than he had on secrecy about Massima. Perrin had been exiled from Rand's presence, and no one was to know anything remained between them except enmity. He knows, Perrin. I'm sure of it. Magden saw pigeon coats everywhere in Amador, and apparently the Shonchan didn't look at them twice. By this time, any merchant who has business with Amador has heard, and so has the White Tower. Believe me, Rand must have too. You have to trust that he knows best. In this, he does. She was not always so certain of that. Maybe, Perrin muttered irritably. He tried not to worry about Rand's sanity, but Rand made Perrin at his most suspicious look like a child skipping in a meadow. How much did Rand trust even him? Rand kept things back, had plans he never let on. Exhaling, Perrin settled back in the chair, gulped a swallow of tea. The truth of it was, mad or sane, Rand was right. If the Forsaken caught a suspicion of what he was up to, or the White Tower did, they would find some way to overturn the anvil on his feet. At least I can give the Tower's eyes and ears less to talk about. This time I'm burning that bloody banner. And the wolf head, too. He might have to play at being a lord, but he could do it without a bloody flag. Fail's full lips pursed judiciously, and she shook her head slightly. Slipping from her chair, she knelt beside him, took his wrist in her hands. Perrin met her level gaze warily. When she looked at him so intently, so seriously, she was about to tell him something important. That, or pull the wool over his eyes and spin him around till he did not know front from back. Her scent told him nothing. He tried to stop smelling her. It was all too easy to lose himself in that. And then she would pull the wool over his eyes. One thing he had learned since marrying, a man needed all of his wits dealing with a woman. Too often, even that was not enough. Women did what they wanted as surely as Aes Sedai. "You might want to reconsider, husband," she murmured. A tiny smile quirked her mouth as if she once again knew what he was thinking. "I doubt anyone who's seen us since we entered Ghealdan knew what the Red Eagle is. Around a town the size of Bethel, some will, though. And the longer we have to hunt for Masema, the greater the chance." He did not bother with saying that was all the more reason to get rid of the banner. Fail was no fool, and she thought much faster than he. "Then why keep it?" he asked slowly. "When all it'll do is draw eyes to the idiot everybody will think is trying to pull Manetheren out of the grave." Men had tried that in the past, and women too. The name of Manetheren carried powerful memories, and it was
charge that.
because it will draw eyes. She leaned toward him intently. To a man trying to raise up Manetheren again. Lesser folk will smile to your face, hope you ride on soon, and try to forget you as soon as you do. As for the greater, they've too much in front of their faces right now to look twice unless you pinch their noses. Compared to the Seanchan or the Prophet or the White Cloaks, a man trying to raise Manetheren is small turnips. And I think it's safe to say the Tower won't look twice either, not now. Her smile widened, and the light in her eyes said she was about to make her most telling point. But most important, no one will think that man is doing anything else. Abruptly, her smile vanished. She stuck a finger against his nose, hard. And don't call yourself an idiot, Perrin Tabashir Aybara. Not even sideways like that. You aren't, and I do not like it. Her scent was tiny spikes, not true anger, but definitely displeased. Quicksilver, a kingfisher flashing by faster than thought. Certainly faster than his thoughts. It would never have occurred to him to hide so flagrantly. But he could see the sense. It was like concealing the fact that you were a murderer by claiming to be a thief. Yet it might work. Chuckling, he kissed her fingertip. "The banner stays," he said. He supposed that meant the wolf head did too. Blood and bloody ashes. Alejandra has to know the truth, though. If she thinks Rand means to set me up as king of Manetheren and take her lands. Fail rose so suddenly, turning away, that he was afraid he had made a mistake bringing up the queen. Alejandra could lead to Berlane all too easily, and Fail smelled prickly, wary. But what she said over her shoulder was, "Alejandro won't be a bit of trouble for Perrin Goldeneyes. That bird's as good as netted, husband. So it's time to put our minds on how to find Massima." Kneeling gracefully beside a small chest against the tent wall, the only chest without draperies, she lifted the lid and began removing rolled maps. Perrin hoped she was right about Alejandra, because he did not know what to do if she was wrong. If only he were half what she thought him. Alejandra was a netted bird. The Sean-Chan would fall over like dolls for Perrin Goldeneyes, and he would snatch up the prophet and take him to Rand if Massima had 10,000 men around him. Not for the first time he realized that however much her anger hurt and confused him, it was her disappointment he feared. If he ever saw that in her eyes, it would rip the heart out of his chest. He knelt beside her and helped her spread out the largest map, covering the south of Gildan and the north of Amadisia, and studied it as though Massima's name would leap off the parchment at him. He had more reason than Rand to want to succeed. Whatever else, he could not fail Fail.
Fail lay in the darkness, listening until she was sure that Perrin's breath had the deep rhythm of sleep, then slipped out from the blankets they shared. Rueful amusement touched her as she pulled her linen nightdress up over her head. Did he really think she would not find out that he'd hidden the bed deep in a copse one morning while the carts were being loaded? Not that she minded, not a great deal at least. She was sure she had slept on the ground as often as he. She had pretended surprise, of course, and made light of it. Anything else, and he would have apologized, perhaps even gone back to fetch the bed. Managing a husband was an art, so her mother said. Had Dira ni Galeen ever found it so difficult? Scuffing her bare feet into slippers, she shrugged into a silk robe, then hesitated, looking down at Perrin. He would be able to see her clearly if he woke, but to her he was just a shadowed mound. She wished her mother were there now to advise her. She loved Perrin with every fiber of her being, and he confused every fiber. Actually understanding men was impossible, of course, but he was so unlike anyone she had grown up with. He never swaggered, and instead of laughing at himself, he was modest. She had not believed a man could be modest. He insisted that only chance had made him a leader, claimed he did not know how to lead, when men who met him were ready to follow after an hour. He dismissed his own thinking as slow, when those slow, considering thoughts saw so deeply that she had to dance a merry jig to keep any secrets at all. He was a wonderful man, her curly-haired wolf, so strong and so gentle. Sighing, she tiptoed from the tent. His ears had caused her difficulties before. The camp lay quiet beneath a gibbous moon that gave as much light in a cloudless sky as it normally would have full, a brightness that washed out the stars. Some sort of night-bird cried shrilly, then fell silent at an owl's deep hoot. There was a small breeze, and for a wonder it actually seemed a little cool, probably her imagination. The nights were cool only in comparison to the days. Most of the men were asleep, dark humps among the shadows beneath the trees. A few remained awake, talking around the handful of fires still burning. She made no effort to hide, but none noticed her. Some appeared half asleep where they sat, heads nodding. If she had not known how well the men on sentry duty would be keeping watch, she might have thought the camp could be surprised by a herd of wild cattle. Of course the maidens would be on guard in the night, too, but it did not matter if they saw her either. The high-wheeled carts made long shadowed rows, the servants already snug and snoring beneath, most of the servants. One fire still crackled there. Megden and her friends sat around it. Talanvor was talking, gesturing fiercely, but only the other men seemed to be paying him any mind, though he appeared to be addressing himself to Megden. That they had had better garb in their bundles than those near rags was not surprising, but their former mistress must have had a very free hand to give out silk to her people, and Megden wore finely cut silk indeed, in a muted blue. None of the others was dressed so well, so perhaps Megden had been their lady's favorite. A twig snapped under Fail's foot, and heads whipped around. Tullenbor starting to his feet, half drawing his sword before he saw her gathering her robe in the moonlight. They were more alert than the Two Rivers men behind her. For an instant the lot of them just stared at her, then Megden rose gracefully and made a deep curtsy, and the others hastily followed her example with varying degrees of skill. Only Megden and Balwer appeared at all at ease. A nervous smile split Gil's round face. "Go on with what you were doing," Fail told them kindly, "but don't stay up too late. Tomorrow will be full." She walked on, but when she glanced back they were still standing, still peering after her. Their travels must have made them wary as rabbits, always watching for a fox. She wondered how well they would fit in. Over the next few weeks she would be busy training them to her ways, learning theirs. One was as important as the other for a well-run household. The time would have to be found. They did not stay long in her thoughts, though. Soon she was beyond the carts, not quite out to where Two Rivers men would be keeping sharp watch from up in the trees. Nothing larger than a mouse would get by them unseen. Even some of the maidens had been spotted upon occasion, but they were watching for anyone attempting to sneak in, not for those who had a right to be there. In a small moonlit clearing, her people were waiting. Some of the men bowed, and Paralian nearly went to one knee before stopping himself. Several women instinctively made curtsies that looked quite peculiar in men's garb, then dropped their eyes or shifted in embarrassment at realizing what they had done. The manners of the court had been bred into them, though they tried very hard to adopt Aiel customs. What they believed were Aiel customs, at least. Sometimes they horrified the maidens with what they believed. Perrin called them fools, and they were in some ways, but they had sworn fealty to her, these Kyrianen and Tyrans. Water oath they named it, copying the Aiel, trying to, and that made them hers. Among themselves they had taken to calling their society Cha-Fail, the Falcon's Talon, though they had seen the necessity of keeping that quiet. They were not fools in all ways. In fact, around the edges anyway, they were not too unlike the young men and women she had grown up with. Those she had sent off early that morning had just returned, for the women among them were still changing out of the dresses they had worn of necessity. Even one woman dressed as a man would have roused notice in Bethal, not to mention 5. The clearing was a great flurry of skirts and shifts, coats and shirts and breeches. The women made believe they did not mind being unclothed in front of others, including men, since the Aiel apparently did not, but haste and labored breathing gave them the lie. The men were all shifting feet and turning heads, torn between looking away decently and watching as they thought the Aiel did, while pretending they were not looking at half-dressed women. Fail held her robe close over her nightdress. She could not have dressed further without waking Perrin for sure, but she made no pretense at comfort. She was no Damani to receive her retainers in her bath. "Forgive us for being late, my lady Fail," Salanda panted, tugging her coat on. The accents of Kyrian were sharp in the short woman's voice. Even for a Kyrianan, she was not tall. She managed a credible swagger, though, a suitable boldness in the tilt of her head and the set of her shoulders. "We would have returned sooner, but the gate guards made a bother letting us out." "A bother?" Fail said sharply. If only she could have seen with her own eyes on top of theirs. If only Perrin had let her go instead of that trollop. No, she would not think about Berylane. It was not Perrin's fault. She repeated that to herself 20 times a day, like a prayer. But why was the man so blind? "What kind of bother?" She drew a chagrined breath. "Troubles with your husband should never affect your tone with your vassals." "Nothing of note, my lady." Salanda buckled her sword belt and settled it on her hips. "They let some fellows ahead of us drive their wagons through without a second look, but they were worried about letting women go out into the night." Some of the other women laughed. The 5 men who had gone into Bethal stirred irritably, no doubt because they had not been thought enough protection. The rest of Cha-Fail made a thick semicircle behind those 10, watching Fail closely, listening closely. Moonlight shadowed their faces. "Tell me what you saw," Fail commanded in a calmer tone. "Much better." Salanda made her report concisely, and for all Fail's wishes that she had gone herself, she had to admit they had seen almost as much as she could have wished. The streets of Bethel were nearly empty, even at the busiest hours of the day. People stayed to their own homes as much as possible. A little commerce trickled, but few merchants ventured into this part of Gildan, and barely enough food came in from the countryside to keep everyone fed. Most of the townspeople seemed stunned, afraid of what lay outside the walls, sinking deeper and deeper into apathy and despair. Everyone kept their mouths closed for fear of the Prophet's spies, and their eyes as well, for fear of being taken for spies. The Prophet had a deep effect. For instance, however many bandits roamed the hills, cut purses and footpads had vanished from Bethel. It was said the Prophet's penalty for a thief was to cut off the man's hands, though that did not seem to apply to his own people. The Queen tours the city every day, showing herself to keep spirits up, Salanda said. But I do not think it helps much. She is making a progress here in the south to remind people they have a queen. Maybe she has had more success elsewhere. The watch has been added to the wall guards and all but a handful of her soldiers, too. Perhaps it makes the townsfolk feel safer. Until she moves on. Unlike everyone else, Alejandra herself apparently feels no fear the Prophet will come storming over the walls. She walks alone in the gardens of Lord Telabin's palace, morning and evening, and keeps only a few soldiers, who spend most of their time in the kitchens. Everybody in the city seems as concerned with food, with how long there will be enough, as they are with the Prophet. In truth, my lady, for all the guards on the walls, I think if Massima appeared at the gates alone, they might give him the town. They would, Meralda put in contemptuously, buckling her own sword round her waist, and beg for mercy. Dark and stocky, Meralda was as tall as Fail, but the Tyran woman ducked her head at a frown from Salanda, and murmured an apology. There were no doubts who led Shah Fail after Fail herself. She had been pleased there was no need to change the precedents they had established. Salanda was the brightest of them, except perhaps for Perleon, and only Arala and Kamila were quicker. And Salanda had something extra, a steadiness, as if she had already faced the worst fear in her life, and nothing could ever be that bad again. Of course, she wanted a scar like those some of the maidens had. Fail possessed several small scars, badges of honor, most of them, but actually seeking one was idiocy. At least the woman was not too very eager in the matter. We made a required, my lady, the diminutive woman finished with a last warning glance at Meralda. We marked out Lord Telebin's palace on the back as much as we could, but I fear that is not much more than the gardens and stables. Fail did not try to make out the lines on the paper she unfolded in the moonlight. A pity she had not been able to go herself. She could have mapped the interior, too. No. Done was done, as Perrin liked to say, and it was enough. You are certain no one searches wagons leaving the city? Even in the pale light, she could see confusion on many of the faces in front of her. None knew why she had sent some of them into Bethel. Salanda did not look confused. Yes, my lady, she said calmly, quite bright, and more than quick enough. The wind gusted for a moment, rustling leaves on the trees, rustling dead leaves on the ground, and Fail wished she had Perrin's ears, his nose and eyes, too. It did not matter if anyone saw her here with her retainers, but eavesdroppers would be something else. You've done very well, Salanda. All of you have. Perrin knew the dangers here, as real as any farther south. He knew, but like most men, he thought with his heart as often as his head. A wife had to be practical to keep her husband out of trouble. That had been her mother's very first piece of advice on married life. At first light, you will return to Bethel, and if you receive word from me, this is what you will do. Even Salanda's eyes widened in shock as she went on, but no one murmured the slightest protest. Fail would have been surprised if anyone had. Her instructions were to the point. There would be some danger, but under the circumstances not nearly what might have been. Are there any questions? She said finally. Does everyone understand? With one voice, Chaf Fail answered. We live to serve Our Lady Fail. and that meant they would serve her beloved wolf, whether he wanted them to or not. Megden shifted in her blankets on the hard ground, sleep eluding her. That was her name now, a new name for a new life. Megden for her mother, and Dorlane for a family on an estate that had been hers. A new life for an old life gone, but ties of the heart could not be cut. And now, a faint crackle of dead leaves brought her head up, and she watched a dim shape pass through the trees, the Lady Fail, returning to her tent from wherever she had gone. A pleasant young woman, kind-hearted and well-spoken. Whatever her husband's stock, she almost certainly was nobly born, but young, inexperienced. That might be a help. Megden let her head fall back on the cloak she had wadded up for a pillow. Light. What was she doing here? Taking service as a lady's maid? No. She would hold on to her confidence in herself, at least. She could still find that. She could, if she dug deeply. Her breath caught at the sound of footsteps close by. Talonvor knelt gracefully at her side. He was shirtless, moonlight gleaming on the smooth muscles of his chest and shoulders, his face in shadows. A slight breeze ruffled his hair. "What madness is this?" he asked softly. "Entering service? What are you up to? And don't tell me that nonsense about making a new life. I don't believe it. No one does." She tried to turn away, but he laid a hand on her shoulder. He exerted no pressure, yet it stopped her as surely as a halter. "Light, please let her not tremble." The light did not listen, but at least she managed to keep her voice steady. "If you haven't noticed, I must make my way in the world now. Better as a lady's maid than a tavern maid. You may feel free to go on alone if service here doesn't suit." "You didn't abdicate your wits or your pride when you gave up the throne," he muttered. "Burn Linny for revealing that. If you mean to pretend that you did, I suggest you avoid letting Linny get you alone." The man chuckled at her. He chuckled, oh, so richly. "She wants a word with Megden, and I suspect she won't be as gentle with Megden as she was with Morgaze." Angrily she sat up, brushing his hand away. "Are you blind, and deaf as well? The Dragon Reborn has plans for Elaine. Light, I wouldn't like it if he simply knew her name. It must be more than chance that brought me to one of his henchmen, Talonvor. It has to be. Burn me, I knew it must be that. I hoped I was wrong, but..." He sounded as angry as she. He had no right to be angry. "Elaine is safe in the White Tower. The Amerlin seat won't let her anywhere near a man who can channel, even if he is the Dragon Reborn, especially if he is. And Megden Dorlane can do nothing about the Amerlin seat, the Dragon Reborn, or the Lion Throne. All she can do is get her neck snapped or her throat cut, or..." "Megden Dorlane can watch," she broke in, at least partly to stop that awful litany. "She can listen. She can..." Irritably, she trailed off. What could she do? Suddenly she realized she was sitting there in a thin shift, and hurriedly folded her blankets around her. The night actually seemed a little cool, or maybe the goosebumps on her skin were from Talonvor's unseen eyes on her. The thought roused a flush in her cheeks she hoped he could not see. Luckily, it put a heat in her voice, too. She was not a girl to go blushing because a man looked at her. "I will do what I can, whatever that is. The chance will come to learn something or do something that will help Elaine, and I will take it." "A dangerous decision," he told her calmly. She wished she could make out his face in the darkness, only to read his expression, of course. "You heard him threaten to hang anyone who looked at him the wrong way. I can believe it in a man with those eyes, like a beast. I was surprised he let that fellow go. I thought he'd rip his throat out. If he discovers who you are, who you used to be, Balwer might betray you. He never really explained why he helped us escape, Amador. Maybe he thought Queen Morgaze would give him a new position. Now he knows there's no chance of that, and he might want to curry favor with his new master and mistress." "Are you afraid of Lord Perrin Goldeneyes?" she demanded contemptuously. Light! The man frightened her. Those eyes belonged on a wolf. "Balwer knows enough to hold his tongue. Anything he says will reflect on him. He came with me, after all. If you're afraid, then ride on." "You always fling that in my face," he sighed, settling back on his heels. She could not see his eyes, but she could feel them. "Ride on if you wish, you say. Once there was a soldier loved a queen from afar, knowing it was hopeless, knowing he could never dare speak. Now the queen is gone, and only a woman remains, and I hope. I burn with hope. If you want me to leave, Magdalen, say it. One word. Go. A simple word." She opened her mouth. A simple word, she thought. Light, it's only one word. Why can't I say it? Light, please. For the second time that night, Light failed to hear. She sat there, huddled in her blankets like a fool, her mouth open, her face growing hotter and hotter. If he had chuckled again, she would have put her belt knife in him. If he had laughed or given any sign of triumph. Instead, he leaned forward and gently kissed her eyes. She made a sound deep in her throat. She could not seem to move. Wide-eyed, she watched him stand. He loomed in the moonlight. She was a queen. She had been a queen, used to command, used to hard decisions in hard times, but right then the pounding of her heart drummed thought from her head. "Had you said go," he told her, "I'd have buried hope, but I could never leave you." Not until he was back in his own blankets could she make herself lie down and draw hers around her. She breathed as if she had been running. The night was cool. She was shivering, not trembling. Talonvor was young, too young. Worse, he was right. Burn him for that. A lady's maid could do nothing to affect events. And if the Dragon Reborn's wolf-eyed killer learned that he had Morgaze of Andor in his hands, she could be used against Elaine instead of helping her. He had no right to be right when she wanted him to be wrong. The illogic of that thought infuriated her. There was a chance she might do some good. There had to be. In the back of her head, a small voice laughed. "You can't forget that you're Morgaze Trakand," it told her scornfully. "And even after she's abdicated her throne, Queen Morgaze can't stop trying her hand in the affairs of the mighty, no matter how much ruin she's made of it so far. And she can't tell a man to go away, either, because she can't stop thinking how strong his hands are and how his lips curve when he smiles. And, furious, she pulled the blanket over her head, trying to shut out the voice. She was not staying because she could not walk away from power. As for Talonvor, she would set him firmly in his place. This time she would. But what was his place, with a woman who was no longer a queen? She tried to put him out of her mind, and tried to ignore that mocking voice that would not be quiet. Yet when sleep finally came, she could still feel the pressure of his lips on her eyelids.
Chapter 9. Tangles. Perrin woke before first light as usual, and as usual, Fail was already up and about. She could make a mouse seem noisy when she wanted to, and he suspected that if he woke an hour after lying down, she would still manage to be up first. The door flaps were tied back, the side panels raised a little at the bottom, and a stir of air rose through the vent hole in the peak, enough to create an illusion of coolness. Perrin actually shivered while searching for his shirt and breeches. Well, it was supposed to be winter, even if the weather did not know it. He dressed in the dark and scrubbed his teeth with salt, needing no lamps. When he left the tent, stamping his feet into his boots, Fail had her new servants gathered around her in the deep grayness of early morning, some holding lighted lanterns. A lord's daughter needed servants. He should have arranged for it before this. There were 2 Rivers folk in Camelin that Fail had trained herself, but with the need for secrecy, there had been no way to fetch them along. Master Gil would want to go home as soon as possible, and Lamgwin and Brianna with him. But maybe Megden and Linny would stay. Aram straightened from where he had been sitting cross-legged beside the tent and waited silently on Perrin. If Perrin had not stopped him, Aram would have slept across the entrance. This morning, his coat was striped red and white, though the white was a trifle dingy, and even here that wolf-head pummeled sword hilt rose over his shoulder. Perrin had left his axe in the tent, and grateful to be rid of it. Talonvor still wore his sword belted over his coat, but not Master Gil or the other two. Fail must have been watching, because no sooner did Perrin come out than she gestured toward the tent, clearly issuing orders. Magdalene and Brianna came bustling past him and Aram with lanterns, their jaws set, smelling of determination for some reason. Neither curtsied, a pleasant surprise. Winnie did, a quick bend of the knee before she darted after the other two, muttering about knowing their place. Perrin suspected Lenny was one of those women who saw her place as being in charge. Come to think of it, most women did. That was the way of the world, it seemed, not just the two rivers. Talonvor and Lamgren followed close behind the women, and Lamgren was as serious about bowing as Talonvor, who was almost grim. Perrin sighed and bowed back, and they both gave a start, gaping at him. A curt shout from Lenny jerked them into the tent. With only a quickly flashed smile for him, Fail strode off toward the carts, talking alternately to Basil Gill on one side of her and Sebin Balwer on the other. The men each held a lantern out to light her way. Of course, a double handful of those idiots kept pace where they could hear if she raised her voice, strutting and stroking sword hilts and staring about in the dimness as though they expected an attack or hoped for one. Perrin tugged at his short beard. She always found plenty of work to fill her hours, and nobody took it out of her hands. Nobody would dare. Not so much as the first fingers of dawn showed on the horizon yet, but the Carriennen were beginning to stir around the carts, and moving more quickly the closer Fail came. By the time she reached them, they appeared to be trotting, their lanterns bobbing and swinging in the dimness. The two Rivers men, used to farmers' days, were already making breakfast, some laughing and roughhousing around their cook fires, some grumping, but most getting the work done. A few tried to stay in their blankets and were unceremoniously tumbled out. Grady and Neild were up too, as always off by themselves, shadows in black coats among the trees. Perrin could not recall seeing them without those coats, always buttoned to the neck, always clean and unwrinkled come sunrise, whatever they had looked like the night before. Stepping through the forms in unison, the pair were practicing the sword as they did every morning. That was better than their evening practice, when they would sit cross-legged, hands on knees, staring at some distant nothing. They never did anything that anyone could see, yet not a man in the camp but knew what they were about and kept as far off as possible. Not even the maidens would step into their line of sight then. Something was missing, Perrin realized with a start. Fail always had one of the men meet him first thing with a bowl of the thick porridge they breakfasted on. It seemed she had been too busy this morning. Brightening, he hurried toward the cook fires, hoping at least to be able to dip his own porridge for once. A small hope. Glenn Barsteer, a lanky fellow with a dent in his chin, met him halfway and shoved a carved bowl into his hands. Glenn was from up toward Watch Hill, and Perrin did not know him well, but they had been hunting together a time or two, and once Perrin had helped him dig one of his father's cows out of a bog hole in the waterwood. "The Lady Fail told me to bring this to you, Perrin," Glenn said anxiously. "You won't tell her I forgot, will you? You won't tell? I found some honey, and I put in a good dollop." Perrin tried not to sigh. At least Flann had remembered his name. Well, maybe he could not get away with doing the simplest chores for himself, but he was still responsible for the men eating beneath the trees. Without him, they would be with their families, getting ready for the day's chores around the farm, milking cows and cutting firewood instead of wondering whether they might have to kill or be killed before sunset. Gulping down the honeyed porridge quickly, he told Aram to take his ease over breakfast. But the man looked so miserable that he relented, so Aram followed as he made his way around the camp. The journey was not one Perrin enjoyed. Men put down their bowls when he approached, or even stood until he passed. He gritted his teeth whenever somebody he had grown up with, or worse, a man who had sent him on errands as a boy, called him Lord Perrin. Not everyone did, but too many. Far too many. After a time, he gave up telling them to stop out of sheer weariness. All too often the reply was, "Oh, whatever you say, Lord Perrin." It was enough to make a man howl. Despite that, he made himself pause to speak a word or two to every man. Mainly, though, he kept his eyes open, and his nose. They all knew well enough to keep their bows in good repair and tend the fletching and points on their arrows. But some would wear the soles out of their boots or the bottom out of their breeches without noticing, or let blisters fester because they could not be bothered to do anything about them just yet. Several had the habit of picking up brandy when they could, and 2 or 3 of those had no head for it at all. There had been a small village the day before reaching Bethel that held no fewer than 3 inns. It was very strange. Having Mistress Lujan or his mother tell him he needed new boots or his breeches mended had always been embarrassing, and he was sure he would have been irritated at the same from anybody else. But from grizzled old John Dinbaran on down, the Two Rivers men just said, "Why, right you are, Lord Perrin. I'll see to it straight away," or some such. He caught a number of them grinning at one another when he moved on, and they smelled pleased. When he rooted a clay jar of pear brandy out of Jory Conger's saddlebags, a skinny fellow who ate twice as much as anyone else and always looked as if he had not had a bite in a week. Jory was a good shot with a bow, but given a chance, he would drink until he could not stand, and he had light fingers besides. Jory gave him a wide-eyed look and spread his hands as if he did not know where the jar had come from. But as Perrin walked on, emptying the brandy onto the ground, Jory laughed. "You can't put anything over on Lord Perrin." He sounded proud. Sometimes Perrin thought he was the only sane person left. Another thing he noticed, one and all, they were very interested in what he did not say. Man after man cast an eye toward the 2 banners that occasionally flapped atop their poles in a brief gust, Red Wolfhead and Red Eagle. They eyed the banners and watched him, waiting for the order he had given every time the things had come out since reaching Gildan. And often enough before that. Except that he had said nothing yesterday, and he said nothing today, and he saw speculation blooming on men's faces. He left behind clusters of men peering at the banners and at him, murmuring excitedly among themselves. He did not try to listen. What would they say if he was wrong? If the White Cloaks or King Auron decided they could look away from the Prophet and the Shonchan long enough to snuff out a supposed rebellion? They were his responsibility, and he had already gotten too many of them killed. The sun was more than peaking above the horizon, spreading a sharp morning light by the time he finished, and over at the tent, Talonvor and Lamgwin were lugging out chests under Linny's direction, while Megden and Brianna appeared to be sorting the contents out on a broad patch of dead grass, blankets and linens mainly, and long bright swaths of silk satin that had been intended to drape the bed he had misplaced. Fael must have been inside, because that gaggle of idiots were cooling their heels not far off. No carrying and hauling for them, useful as rats in the barn. Perrin thought about taking a look at Stayer and Stepper, but when he glanced through the trees at the horse lines, he was seen. No fewer than 3 of the farriers stepped out anxiously, watching him. They were blocky men in leather aprons, like as eggs in a basket, though Falton had only a fringe of white around his head, Eamon was graying, and Jerasid had not yet come into his middle years. Perrin growled at the sight of them. They would hover if he laid a hand on either horse, and goggle if he lifted a hoof. The one time he had tried to change a worn shoe, on Stayer, all 6 farriers had darted about, grabbing up tools before he could touch them, nearly knocking the bay over in their rush to do the work themselves. "They're afraid you don't trust them," Aram said suddenly. Perrin looked at him in surprise, and Aram shifted his shoulders in his coat. "I've talked to them some. They think if a lord tends his own horses, it must be because he doesn't trust them. You might send them off with no way to get home." His tone said they were fools to think that, but he gave Perrin a sideways glance and shrugged again uncomfortably. "I think they're embarrassed, too. If you don't behave the way they think a lord should, it reflects on them as they see it." "Light," Perrin muttered. Fael had said the same, about them being embarrassed, right? But he had believed it just the lord's daughter talking. Fael had grown up surrounded by servants, yet how could a lady know the thoughts of a man who had to work for his bread? He frowned toward the horse lines. 5 of the farriers stood together watching him now, embarrassed that he wanted to look after his own horses, and upset that he did not want them pulling wool and scratching gravel all over the place. "Do you think I ought to act like a fool in silk small clothes?" he asked. Aram blinked and began studying his boots. "Light," Perrin growled. Spotting Basil Gill hurrying from the direction of the carts, Perrin moved to meet him. He did not think he had done very well at making Gill feel at ease yesterday. The stout man was talking to himself and once more mopping his head with a kerchief, sweating away in a rumpled dark gray coat. The day's heat was beginning to take hold already. He did not see Perrin until Perrin was nearly on him, and then he gave a jump, stuffing the kerchief into a coat pocket and making a bow. He looked curried and brushed, fit for a feast day. "Ah, my Lord Perrin, your lady told me to take a cart into Bethal. She says I'm to find you some Two Rivers tobacco if I can. But I don't know if that's possible. Two Rivers leaf has always been dear, and trade isn't what it was." "She's sending you for tobacco?" Perrin said, frowning. He supposed secrecy had gone down the well, but still. "I bought 3 casks, 2 villages back. Enough for everybody." Gil shook his head firmly. "Not Two Rivers leaf, and your lady says you like that above any other. The Gil Dunnan leaf will do for your men. I'm to be your Shambayan, she called it, and keep you and her supplied with what you need. Not much different from what I did running the Blessing, really." The similarity seemed to amuse him. His belly shook with quiet chuckles. "I have quite a list, though I can't say how much of it I'll find. Good wine, herbs, fruit, candles and lamp oil, oilcloth and wax, paper and ink, needles, pins, all sorts of things. Talangor and Lamgwin and I are going, with some of your lady's other retainers." His lady's other retainers. Talangor and Lamgwin were bringing out yet another chest for the women to sort through. They had to pass by the squatting clump of young fools who never offered to lend a hand. In fact, the layabouts ignored them completely. "You keep an eye on that lot," Perrin cautioned. "If one of them starts any trouble, if he even looks as if he will, you have Lamgwin crack his head." "And if it was one of the women?" "They were just as likely, maybe more so." Perrin grunted. Fail's retainers were going to tie his belly into permanent knots yet. Too bad she could not be satisfied with the likes of Master Gil and Megden. "You didn't mention Balwer. Has he decided to go on alone?" Just then, a shift in the breeze brought him Balwer's scent.
Hey,
Bay
Watcher, how you doing?
With the fellow's almost desiccated exterior.
Just here doing a little gaming,
Even to so reading a
smoking,
man, Balwer made surprisingly
listening to a
little
book.
noise in the dried leaves underfoot. In a sparrow brown coat, he offered a
Hope you're
quick
doing
bow,
good.
and his tilted head added to the image of a bird. "I am staying, my lord," he said cautiously. Or maybe that was just his manner. "As your gracious lady's secretary. And yours, you." He stepped closer, very nearly a hop. "I am well versed, my lord. I possess a good memory and write a good hand, and my lord can be assured that whatever he confides in me will never pass my lips to another. The ability to keep secrets is a primary skill of a secretary. Don't you have pressing duties for our new mistress, Master Gil?" Gil frowned at Balwer, opened his mouth, then closed it with a snap. Spinning on his heel, he trotted away toward the tent. For a moment, Balwer watched him go, head to one side, lips pursed thoughtfully. "I can offer other services as well, my lord," he said finally. "Knowledge. I have overheard some of my lord's men speaking, and I understand that my lord may have had some difficulties with the children of the light. A secretary learns many things. I know a surprising amount about the children." "With any luck, I can avoid white cloaks," Perrin told him. "Better if you knew where the prophet is, or the Shonchan." He did not expect any of that, of course, but Balwer surprised him. "I cannot be certain, of course, but I think the Shonchan have not spread far beyond Amador as yet. Fact is difficult to sift from rumor, my lord, but I keep my ears open. Of course, they do seem to move with unexpected suddenness. A dangerous people with large numbers of Tarabana soldiers. I believe from Master Gil that my lord knows of them, but I observed them closely in Amador, and what I saw is at my lord's disposal. As to the prophet, There are as many rumors concerning him as the Shonchan, but I believe I can say reliably that he was recently at Abila, a largish town some 40 leagues south of here. Bulwer smiled thinly, a brief, self-satisfied smile. How can you be so sure? Perrin said slowly. As I said, my lord, I keep my ears open. The prophet reportedly closed a number of inns and taverns and tore down those he considered too disreputable. Several were mentioned, and by chance I happen to know there are inns of those names in Abila. I think there is little chance another town would have inns with the same names. He flashed another narrow smile. He certainly smelled pleased with himself. Perrin scratched his beard thoughtfully. The man just happened to remember where some inns that Messima supposedly had torn down were located, and if Messima had turned out not to be there after all, well, these days rumors sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Bulwer sounded a man trying to build up his own importance. Thank you, Master Bulwer. I'll keep that to mind. If you hear any more, be sure to tell me. As he turned to go, the man caught his sleeve. Bulwer's skinny fingers went immediately, as though burned, and he made one of those bird-like bows, dry washing his hands. Forgive me, my lord. I hesitate to press, but do not take the white cloaks too lightly. Avoiding them is wise, but it may not be possible. They are much closer than the Shonchan. Even Welda, the new Lord Captain Commander, led most of their numbers toward northern Amadisia before Amador fell. He was hunting the prophet also, my lord. Volda is a dangerous man, and Radam Asunawa, the Grand Inquisitor, makes Volda seem pleasant. And I fear neither has any love for your own lord. Forgive me. He bowed again, hesitated, then went on smoothly. If I may say so, my lord's display of Menethren's banner is inspired. My lord will be more than a match for Volda and Asunawa if he takes care. Watching him bow himself away, Perrin thought he knew part of Bulwer's story now. Clearly, he also had run afoul of the White Cloaks. That could take no more than being on the same street with them, a frown at the wrong time, but it seemed Bulwer had a grudge. A sharp mind, too, seeing right away about the Red Eagle, and a sharp tongue with Master Gil. Gil was on his knees beside Megden, talking rapidly despite Linny's effort to hush him. Megden had turned to stare after Bulwer as the fellow hurried through the trees toward the carts, but now and then her gaze swung to Perrin. The rest of them clustered close to her, peering now at Bulwer, now at Perrin. If he had ever seen a group of people worried about what somebody else had said, it was they. But what were they worried he might have heard? Backbiting, probably. Tales of resentments and misdeeds, real or imagined. People cooped up together tended to start pecking at one another. If that was it, maybe he could put a stop before somebody drew blood. Talangor was fondling his sword hilt again. What did Fail intend to do with the fellow? Aram, I want to go talk to Talangor and that lot. Tell them what Bulwer said to me. Just slide it into the talk, but tell everything. That should soothe fears of tale-bearing. Fail said servants needed to be made to feel at home. Make friends with them if you can, Aram. But if you decide to moon over one of the women, be sure it's Linny. The other two are taken. The man had a smooth tongue for any pretty woman, but he managed to look surprised and offended both. As you wish, Lord Perrin, he muttered sulkily. I'll catch you up quickly. I will be over with the Aiel. Aram blinked. Ah, yes. Well, it might take a while at that if I'm to make friends with them. They don't look like they much want friends to me. This from a fellow who stared suspiciously at anyone except Fail who came near Perrin, and never smiled for anyone not wearing a skirt. Nevertheless, he went over and squatted on his heels where he could speak to Gil and the others. Even from a distance, their standoffishness was plain. They continued with their work, only now and then saying a word to Aram, and they looked at each other as often as at him. Skittish as green quail in summer, when the foxes were teaching the cubs to hunt. But at least they were talking. Perrin wondered what mischief Aram had gotten up to with the Aiel. There did not seem to have been any time for it. But he did not wonder long. Any serious trouble with Aiel usually meant someone dead, and not the Aiel. In truth, he was not so eager to meet the Wise Ones himself. He walked around the curve of the hill, but instead of climbing the slope, his feet carried him all the way to the Mayenners. He had stayed away from their camp as much as possible, too, and not simply because of Berylane. There were disadvantages to having too keen a nose. Fortunately, a freshening breeze was carrying most of the stink away, though it did little for the heat. Sweat rolled down the faces of the mounted sentries in their red armor. At the sight of him, they sat up even more rigidly in their saddles, which was saying something. Where the Two Rivers men rode like fellows heading out to the fields, the Mayenners usually were on horseback. They could fight, though. The light said there was no need. Javi and Norella came running, buttoning up his coat before Perrin was well past the sentries. A dozen or so other officers followed at Norella's heels, all coated and some fastening the straps of their red breastplates. 2 or 3 carried helmets with thin red plumes tucked under their arms. Most were years older than Norella, some twice his age, graying men with hard, scarred faces. But Norella's reward for helping to rescue Rand had been to be named Gallien's second, his first lieutenant, they called it. "The first hasn't returned yet, Lord Perrin," Norella said, making a bow mirrored by the others. A tall, slender man, he did not look as young as he had before Duhai's Wells. There was an edge to his eyes, which had seen more blood than most veterans of 20 battles. But if his face was harder, there was still an eagerness to please in his scent. To Javi and Norella, Perrin Ibarra was a man who could fly or walk on water as he chose. "The morning patrols saw nothing. Those that are back. I would have reported otherwise." "Of course," Perrin told him. "I just wanted to look about a bit." He simply meant to walk around until he could work up his nerve to face the Wise Ones, but the young Mayenner followed him with the rest of the officers, anxiously watching for Lord Perrin to find some flaw in the winged guards, wincing whenever they came on bare-chested men tossing dice on a blanket, or some fellow snoring away with the sun on the climb. He need not have bothered. To Perrin, the camp looked laid out with a plumb line and level. Each man had his blankets and his saddle for a pillow, not more than 2 paces from where his horse was tied to one of the long ropes drooping between chest-high poles, set upright in the ground. A cook fire stood every 20 paces, with lances stacked in steel-tipped cones between. The whole made a sort of box around 5 peaked tents, one striped golden blue and larger than the other 4 combined. All very different from the Two Rivers men's every-which-way arrangement. Perrin walked along briskly, trying not to look too much a fool. He was not sure how much success he was having. He itched to stop and look over a horse or two, just to be able to pick up a hoof without somebody practically fainting. But mindful of what Aram had said, he kept his hands to himself. Everyone seemed as startled as Norella at his pace. Tough-eyed bannermen chivied men to their feet, only to have Perrin stride by with a nod before they were all upright. A puzzled murmur trailed in the air behind him, and his ears caught a few comments about officers, lords in particular, that he was just as glad Norella and the others missed. Finally, he found himself on the verge of the camp, staring up the brushy slope toward the Wise Ones' tents. Only a few of the maidens were visible among the scattered trees up there, and some of the Gaishain. "Lord Perrin," Norella said hesitantly, "the Aes Sedai." He stepped closer and lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. "I know they swore to the Lord Dragon, and I've seen things, Lord Perrin. They do camp chores. Aes Sedai. This morning, Masuri and Seomet came down to fetch water. And yesterday, after you returned, I thought I heard someone up there crying out. It couldn't have been one of the sisters, of course. he added hurriedly, and laughed to show how ridiculous the idea was, a very shaky laugh. You will see that everything is all right with them? He had ridden into 40,000 Shido, leading 200 Lancers, but talking about this had him hunching his shoulders and shifting his feet. Of course, he had ridden into 40,000 Shido because an Aes Sedai wanted him to. I'll do what I can, Perrin muttered. Maybe matters were worse than he had thought. Now he had to stop them getting worse still, if he could. He would rather have faced the Shido again. Norella nodded as though Perrin had promised all he had asked and more. That is well, then, he said, sounding relieved. Casting sideways glances at Perrin, he worked himself up to say something else, but apparently this was not so touchy as the Aes Sedai. I heard that you let the Red Eagle stay. Perrin very nearly jumped. Even for just around the hill, news had traveled fast. It seemed the thing to do, he said slowly. Berylane would have to know the truth, yet if too many knew, that truth would spread from the next village they passed, the next farm. This used to be part of Manetheren, he added, as if Norella did not know that perfectly well. He had gotten so he could bend truth like an Aes Sedai, and to men on his side. Not the first time that flag's been raised around here, I'll warrant, but none of those fellows had the Dragon Reborn behind him. And if that did not set the necessary seeds, he did not know how to plow a furrow. Abruptly, he realized that what seemed every last one of the winged guards was watching him with their officers, no doubt wondering what he was saying, after all but running through that way. Even the lean, balding old soldier Galien called his dog robber had come out to stare, and Berlane's maids, a pair of plump, plain-faced women, garbed to match their mistress's tent. Perrin had hardly seen a thing, but he knew he had to give some sort of praise. Raising his voice enough to carry, he said, The winged guards will do Mayenne proud if we ever face another Dumai's Wells. Those were the first words that came to mind, but he winced at saying them. To his shock, shouting rose straight away among the soldiers, cheering Perrin Golden Eyes, and Mayenne for Golden Eyes, and Golden Eyes and Manetheren. Men danced and capered, and some snatched lances from the stacks to shake them so the red streamers waved in the breeze. Grizzled bannermen watched them with arms folded, nodding approval. Norella beamed, and not only him. Officers with gray in their hair and scars on their faces grinned like boys, praised their lessons. Light, he was the only sane man left. He prayed never to see another battle. Wondering whether this was going to cause trouble with Berylane, he made his goodbyes with Norella and the others, tramped up the slope through dead or dying brush, none of it waist-high. Brown weeds crackled beneath his boots. Shouting still filled the Mayenne camp. Even after she learned the truth, the First might not be pleased to have her soldiers cheering him this way. Of course, that could have good points. Maybe she would be angry enough to stop pestering him. Short of the crest, he paused, listening to the cheers finally fade away. No one was going to cheer him here. All of the side flaps were down on the Wise One's low gray-brown tents, closing them in. Only a few of the maidens were in sight now. Squatting easily on their heels beneath a leather leaf that still showed some green, they eyed him curiously. Their hands moved quickly in that way they had of talking among themselves with signs. After a moment, Sula, lifting her heavy belt knife, strode in his direction, a tall, wiry woman with a pink scar across her sunglasses. She glanced back and showed relief that he was alone. It was often hard to tell with Aiel. That is good, Perrin Ebara, she said quietly. The wise ones have not been pleased that you make them come to you. Only a fool displays and I have not taken you for a fool. Perrin scrubbed at his beard. He had been keeping clear of the Wise Ones and the Aes Sedai as much as possible. But he had had no intention of forcing them to come to him. He just found their company uncomfortable, to put it mildly. Well, I need to see Adara now, he told her, about the Aes Sedai. Perhaps I was mistaken after all, Sulin said dryly. But I will tell her. She paused. Tell me something. Terrell Winter and Purin Alhara are close to Siona Tryon, like first brothers with a first sister. She does not like men as much, yet they offer to take her for her. How could they shame her so? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. A pair of Gaishain appeared from the reverse slope, each leading two of the Aiel's pack mules. The white-robed men passed within a few paces, heading down toward the stream. He could not be sure, but he thought both were Shido. The pair kept their eyes meekly down, barely looking up enough to see where they were going. They had had every opportunity to run away, doing chores like that without anyone to watch. Peculiar people. I see you are shocked too, Sulin said. I had hoped you could explain. I will tell Adara. As she started for the tents, she added up, You wetlanders are very strange, Perenebara. Perrin frowned after her, and when she vanished into one of the tents, he turned to frown at the two Gaishain leading the horses to water. Wetlanders were strange? Light. Sonorella had been right in what he heard. It was beyond time to stick his nose into what was going on between the Wise Ones and the Aes Sedai. He should have before this. He wished he did not think it would be the same as sticking his nose into a hornet's nest. It seemed to take a long time for Sulin to reappear, and she did little to help his mood when she did. Holding the tent flap for him, she flicked his belt knife contemptuously with a finger as he ducked through. You should be better armed for this dance, Perenebara, she said. Inside, he was surprised to find all 6 Wise Ones sitting cross-legged on colorful tasseled cushions, their shawls tied around their waists, and their skirts making carefully arranged fans across the layered rugs. He had hoped for just Adara. None looked to be more than 4 or 5 years older than he, some no older at all, but somehow they always made him feel as if he were facing the oldest members of the women's circle, the ones who had spent years learning to sniff out whatever you wanted to hide. Separating one woman's scent from another's was all but impossible, but he hardly needed to. 6 sets of eyes latched onto him, from Janina's pale sky blue to Marlene's purple twilight, not to mention Navarin's sharp green. Every eye could have been a skewer. Adara brusquely motioned him to take a cushion himself, which he did with gratitude, though it put him facing them all in a semicircle. Maybe Wise Ones had designed these tents to make men bend their necks if they wanted to stand upright. Strangely, it was cooler in the dim interior, but he still felt like sweating. Maybe he could not pick one from another, yet these women smelled like wolves studying a tethered goat. A square-faced Gaishain, who was half again as big as he was, knelt to offer a golden cup of dark wine punch on an elaborate silver tray. The Wise Ones already had mismatched silver cups and goblets. Unsure what it meant that he was being offered gold, maybe nothing, yet who could say with Aiel? Perrin took it cautiously. It gave off the scent of plums. The fellow bowed meekly enough when Adara clapped her hands and bent himself out of the tent backward, but the half-healed slash down his hard face had to date from Dumai's wells. Now that you are here, Adara said as soon as the tent flap dropped behind the Gaishain, we will explain again why you must kill the man called Masima Dagar. We should not have to explain again, Delora put in. Her hair and eyes were nearly the same shade as Magdan's, but no one would call her pinched face pretty. Her manner was pure ice. This Masima Dagar is a danger to the Karakan. He must die. The Dreamwalkers have told us, Perenebara. Corella certainly was pretty, and though her fiery hair and piercing eyes made her look as though she had a temper, she was always mild, for a Wise One, and certainly not soft. They have read the dream. The man must die. Perrin took a swallow of plum punch to gain a moment. Somehow, it was cool. It was always the same with them. Rand had not mentioned any warning from the Dreamwalkers. The first time Perrin had mentioned that, only the once, they had thought he was casting doubt on their word, and even Corella had gone hot-eyed. Not that Perrin thought they would lie. Not exactly. He had not caught them in one anyway. But what they wanted for the future, and what Rand wanted, what he himself wanted for that matter, might be very different things. Maybe it was Rand who was keeping secrets. "If you could just give me some idea what this danger is," he said finally. "The Light knows Massima's a madman, but he supports Rand. A fine thing if I go around killing people on our side. That will certainly convince people to join Rand." Sarcasm was lost on them. They looked at him, unblinking. "The man must die," Adara said at last. "It is enough that 3 Dreamwalkers have said so, and 6 wise ones tell you. The same as always." Maybe they did not know any more than that, and maybe he should get on with why he had come. "I want to talk about Sionid and Masuri," he said, and 6 faces turned to frost. Like these women could stare down a stone. Setting the wine cup beside him, he leaned toward them stubbornly. "I'm supposed to show people Aes Sedai sworn to Rand." He was supposed to show Massima, actually, but this did not seem a good time to mention that. "We aren't going to be very cooperative if you lot beat them. Light, they're Aes Sedai. Instead of making them haul water, why don't you learn from them? They must know all sorts of things you don't." Too late, he bit his tongue. The Aiel women did not take offense, though. Not that it showed, anyway. "They know some things we do not," Delora told him firmly. "And we know some they do not." As firmly as a spear point in the ribs. "We learn what there is to learn, Perrin Ebara," Marlene said calmly, combing nearly black hair with her fingers. She was one of the few Aiel he had seen with such dark hair, and she often toyed with it. "And we teach what there is to teach." "In any event," Janina said, "it is none of your affair. Men do not interfere between wise ones and apprentices." She shook her head over his foolishness. "You may stop listening outside and come in, Siona Trigon," Adara said suddenly. Perrin blinked in surprise, but none of the women batted an eye. There was a moment of silence, then the tent flap twitched aside, and Siona ducked inside, kneeling quickly on the rugs. That vaunted Aes Sedai serenity was shattered in her. Her mouth was a thin line, her eyes tight, her face red. She smelled of anger, frustration, and a dozen more emotions, all whirling about so quickly that Perrin could barely separate any out. "May I speak to him?" she asked in a stiff voice. "If you take care what you say," Adara told her. Sipping her wine, the wise one watched over the rim of her cup. A teacher watching a pupil? A hawk watching a mouse? Perrin could not be sure. Except that Adara was very sure of her place, whatever the pairing. So was Siona. But that did not carry over to him. She twisted around to face him on her knees, back going straight, eyes heated. Anger raged in the smell of her. "Whatever you know," she said angrily, "whatever you think you know, you will forget." No, there was not a shred of serenity left in her. "Whatever is between the wise ones and us is for us alone. You will stand aside, avert your eyes, and keep your mouth closed." Amazed, Perrin raked his fingers through his hair. "Light, you're upset because I know you got a switching?" he said incredulously. Well, he would have been too, but not alongside the rest. "Don't you know these women would as soon cut your throat as look at you? Slit your throat and leave you by the side of the road? Well, I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen. I don't like you, but I promised to protect you from the wise ones, or the Ashaman or Rand himself. So come down off that high horse." Realizing he was shouting, he drew a deep, embarrassed breath and settled back on his cushion, snatched up his wine cup, and took a long drink. Siona went stiffer by the word with indignation, and her lip curled well before he finished. You promised? She sneered. You think Aes Sedai need your protection? You... Enough, Idara said quietly, and Siona's jaw snapped shut, though her hands made white-knuckled fists clutching her skirts. What makes you think we would kill her, Pera Nebara? Janina asked curiously. Aiel seldom showed much on their faces, but the others frowned at him, or looked with open incredulity. I know how you feel, he replied slowly. I've known since I saw you with the sisters after Demise Wells. He was not about to explain that he had smelled their hatred, their contempt, every time a wise one looked at an Aes Sedai back then. He did not smell it now, but no one could maintain that level of fury for long without bursting. That did not mean it was gone, only that it had sunk deep, maybe into the bone. Delora snorted, a sound like linen ripping. First you say they must be cuddled because you need them, and now because they are Aes Sedai, and you have promised to protect them. Which is truth, Pera Nebara? Both. Perrin met Delora's hard gaze for a long moment, then eyed each of the others in turn. Both are true, and I mean both. The wise ones exchanged glances, the sort where every flicker of an eyelid held 100 words and no man could make out a one. Finally, in a shifting of necklaces and readjusting of tied shawls, they appeared to reach agreement. We do not kill apprentices, Pera Nebara, Nevarin said. She sounded shocked at the idea. When Randall Thor asked us to apprentice them, perhaps he thought it was just to make them obey us. But we do not speak empty words. They are apprentices now. They will remain so until 5 wise ones agree they are ready to be more, Marlene added, sweeping her long hair over her shoulder. And they are treated no differently than any others. Idara nodded over her wine cup. Tell him the advice you would give him concerning Masima Dagar, Sione Tragan, she said. The kneeling woman had practically writhed during Navarin and Marlene's short speeches, gripping her skirt until Perrin thought the silk might rip, but she wasted no time complying with Idara's instructions. The wise ones are right, whatever their reasons. I do not say this because they wish it. She drew herself up again, smoothing her features with a visible effort. A touch of heat still flared in her voice, though. I saw the work of so-called dragon swarm before I ever met Randall Thor. Death and destruction to no purpose. Even a faithful dog must be put down if he begins to foam at the mouth. Blood and ashes, Perrin grumbled. How can I even let you in the sight of the man after that? You swore fealty to Rand. You know that isn't what he wants. What about that? Thousands will die if you fail. Like if Masuri felt the same, then he had to put up with Aes Sedai and wise ones for nothing. Or worse, he would have to guard Masima from them. Masuri knows Masima for Rabbit as well as I, Sion had replied when he put the question to her. All of her serenity had returned. She regarded him with a cool, unreadable face. Her scent was sharply alert, intent. As if he needed his nose, with her eyes fixed on his, big and dark and bottomless. I swore to serve the Dragon Reborn, and the best service I can give him now is to keep this animal from him. Bad enough that rulers know Masima supports him. Worse if they see him embrace the man. And thousands will die if you fail to get close enough to Masima to kill him. Perrin thought his head would spin. Again an Aes Sedai whirled words about like a top, made it seem she had said black when she meant white. Then the wise ones added their bit. Masuri Sakawa, Nevarin said calmly, believes the rabid dog can be leashed and bound so he may be used safely. For an instant, Sion had looked as surprised as Perrin felt, but she recovered quickly. Outside, she did. Her scent was suddenly wary, as if she sensed a trap where she had not expected one. She also wishes to fit you for a halter, Pera Nebara, Corella added, even more casually. She thinks you must be bound also, to make you say. Nothing on her freckled face told whether she agreed. Adara raised a hand towards Seonid. You may go now. You will not listen further, but you may ask Garadin again to let you heal the wound on his face. Remember, if he still refuses, you must accept it. He is Gashine, not one of your Wetlander servants. She invested that last word with depths of scorn. Seonid stared icy augurs at Perrin. She looked at the wise ones, her lips trembling on the brink of speech. In the end, though, all she could do was go with as good a grace as she could muster. Outwardly, that was considerable, an Aes Sedai being Aes Sedai, fit to shame a queen. But the scent she trailed behind her was frustration sharp enough to cut. As soon as she was gone, the 6 wise ones focused on Perrin again. Now, Adara said, you can explain to us why you would put a rabid animal next to the Karakan. Only a fool obeys another's command to push him over a cliff, Navarre said. You will not listen to us, Janina said, so we will listen to you. Speak, Perrin Ebara. Perrin considered making a break for the door flaps, but if he did, he would leave behind one Aes Sedai, who might possibly be of some doubtful help, and another, along with 6 wise ones, who were all set to ruin everything he had come to do. He put his wine cup down again, and settled his hands on his knees. He needed a clear head if he was to show these women he was no tethered goat. Chapter 10.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.